president of Knox College, and I'm tremendously excited to welcome you all to Orpheum Theatre tonight for the Etz Family Institute for Civic Leadership and Dialogue's inaugural lecture. First, I would like to thank our speakers, John and John. I've been working on that all night. John Corvino and John Inazu for joining us here tonight to launch this lecture series. I also want to thank Professors Thomas Bell and Comrade Hamilton, our inaugural co-directors of the Institute. Thank you. Two years ago, during the fall of 2022, I shared with the Knox community a strategic planning framework for Knox's future titled, A Bold and Ambitious Framework for Growth. The framework focused on making a great college even better, includes ideas, initiatives, and aspirations generated from dozens of community discussions with many of you here tonight. I heard your desire to create space at Knox where we, together, can learn how to deliberately make efforts to confront our differences, to hear people who disagree, and to reflect on or even change our opinions. We shared the idea of this new center with Knox community members and donors as an opportunity that I felt was strategically important and necessary for our students and our entire community. Thankfully, for all of us here tonight, this idea resonated with Chair of the Knox College Board of Trustees, Tony Etz from the class of 1983, and his wife, Nancy Etz, whose vision and generosity brought the Etz Family Institute for Civic Leadership and Dialogue to life. Both talent agents with Creative Artists Agency in Los Angeles, Tony and Nancy's personal and professional experiences inspired them to establish the Institute. When Knox announced its creation last May, Nancy shared, quote, "As two people who've spent our lives as professional negotiators, I think the more fraught a conversation is, the more you have to listen with radical compassion and to understand where people are coming from, even if you don't agree with them," end quote. And that's exactly why we are all here tonight. Our global society is facing extreme polarization, and our world is grappling with war and conflict on multiple fronts. To break free of polarization and to work to end conflict, we need our future leaders around the world to have the skills, practice, and radical compassion to really listen to people who disagree with them and commit to modeling dialogue across our differences. I can think of no better time for us to launch the Etz Family Institute here at Knox, where our future global leaders are learning and growing. Knox College may be a small liberal arts college in the heart of the country, but we have a huge history. The college hosted perhaps the most important Lincoln-Douglas debate of 1858 and has continued to invite and welcome national and international voices to our campus and in our community to engage in active learning and civic discourse ever since. Knox has hosted visits from political figures of all viewpoints, including Presidents Lincoln, Harrison, McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, Taft, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Clinton, and Obama, to diplomats and journalists, including Ellen Browning Scripps from the Knox class of 1859, founder of Scripps Newspapers, former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, and activist and journalist Maria Hinojosa, who gave an incredible commencement address in June of this year. Speaking of Ellen Browning Scripps, let me share just a little bit more about her. 166 years ago, when she was a Knox student, Scripps attended the 5th Lincoln-Douglas debate on the east side of Old Main. She described that debate as, quote, the most important event of her time here at Knox, end quote. Throughout her life, and as I like to believe as a result of her Knox education, Ellen Browning Scripps was particularly interested in education, free speech, women's suffrage, temperance, and world peace, and referred to her significant philanthropic gifts in these areas as, quote, investments in humanity, end quote. I hope that for at least one of you here tonight, this inaugural Etz Institute lecture will be the most important event of your time here at Knox, and you will go on to make your impact on the things that matter most to you, just as Ellen Browning Scripps did. Now, I'd like to hand the program over to Assistant Professor of Political Science and Co-Director of the Etz Institute, Thomas Bell. Professor Bell teaches courses on American institutional law, American political thought, and political philosophy. He is the author of the forthcoming book, The Constitution of Conflict: How the Supreme Court Undermines the Separation of Powers, with the University Press of Kansas. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bell to the stage.
Thank you, President McGadney, for that warm introduction and for your leadership in establishing this new initiative. On behalf of my co-director of the Etz Family Institute, Conrad Hamilton, I also want to thank Tony and Nancy Etz for their investment in Knox College with the generous gift that established the Etz Institute. So much of the work of Knox College is made possible by our amazing alumni who continue to advance the educational and civic mission of Knox College long after they graduate by contributing their time and resources to the next generation of Knox students. While Tony and Nancy can't be here with us tonight to see this in person, would you please join me in a round of applause to thank them for the significant investment in our work today and into the future. As President McGadney mentioned, we live in a time of increasing and intense polarization, and this is perhaps heightened by the fact that we're less than 3 weeks away from one of the most closely contested presidential elections in recent memory. At the end of the day, however, and certainly in the aftermath of any election, we have to find ways as fellow citizens and participants of a diverse democracy to live together and construct the common good even amidst our deep divisions. Out of many, one, as our national motto says. Institutions of higher education are particularly important in this enterprise by creating civic spaces where the stakes in our collective life are lower. None of us is the deciding vote on the Supreme Court or the decisive swing vote in Congress on a hotly contested issue. Rather, we're called to think, discuss, deliberate, and even change our minds about important issues that we hold dear to us. More importantly, democracies require certain habits and dispositions that can sustain it over time. If history is any guide, there's no reason to think that democracies can't fail. And so in this moment of deep division, we couldn't think of a better way of thinking about how we can foster those habits and dispositions of character that would make democracy work over time. And so we're delighted to welcome tonight John Corvino and John Inazu to talk to us about learning to disagree across the culture war, and to welcome them to Knox and to Galesburg in this beautiful theater to launch this new and exciting initiative for our community. Before introducing our speakers, let me say a few words about the format of tonight's lecture. I'm going to introduce both speakers in a moment and introduce them to the stage, and they'll spend the next 45 minutes or so talking with each other about tonight's theme. While they talk, I hope you'll write down reactions and questions that maybe you'd like to ask them, because when they finish speaking, we'll open the door to the audience for questions and answers. And so when we get to that point, Conrad Hamilton and I will have microphones that if you raise your hand, we'll be happy to pass that to you so that you can ask a question. So let me introduce our speakers and welcome them to the stage. John Inazu is the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at Washington University in St. Louis. He earned his JD from Duke Law School and his PhD in political theory at the University of North Carolina. And so I think with his 2 terminal degrees from Duke and North Carolina, he's well positioned to talk about intense disagreement. And maybe in the Q&A you can ask him who he roots for in basketball. John Inazu's scholarship focuses on the First Amendment, freedoms of speech, assembly and religion, and related questions of legal and political theory. His academic books include Liberty's Refuge, The Forgotten Freedom of Assembly, Confident Pluralism, Surviving and Thriving Through Deep Difference. He's the co-editor with Tim Keller of Uncommon Ground, Living Faithfully in a World of Difference, and the author most recently of Learning to Disagree, The Surprising Path to Navigating Differences with Empathy and Respect. And let me pause there to say that we have books for students. For John Inazu, we have Learning to Disagree. We've got 100 copies here, but if we run out, we'll take a list of names and make sure that every student who wants a book gets one. And we have a book as well for John Corvino, which I'll announce in a second. John Inazu is the founder of the Carver Project and the Legal Vocation Fellowship. He's a senior fellow with the Trinity Forum and a senior fellow with Interfaith America, where he co-directs with Ibu Patel the New Begin Fellows. John Corvino is the dean of the Irvin D. Reed Honors College and a professor of philosophy at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. He earned his PhD in philosophy from the University of Texas at Austin. His research focuses mainly on controversial culture war issues surrounding sexuality and marriage. He's the author or co-author of 3 books from Oxford University Press, including Debating Same-Sex Marriage with Maggie Gallagher, What's Wrong with Homosexuality, and most recently, Debating Religious Liberty and Discrimination with Ryan T. Anderson and Sharif Girgis. In addition to his books and scholarly articles, Corvino has contributed to the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Detroit Free Press, the Huffington Post, the New Republic, Slate, Commonwealth, and other popular venues. In the last 25 years, he's spoken at over 250 campuses, so he's well prepared for your questions on issues of sexuality, ethics, and marriage. And his videos have received over 2 million views. And so we're really delighted to welcome both of you here tonight and ready for an engaging and lively conversation. So would all of you join me in welcoming John Inazu and John Corvino to the stage?
Wow, this is beautiful. I understand that there was a power outage earlier, and they thought they were going to have to move the venue last minute. And it reminded me of an event I did in Oklahoma, debating Glenn Stanton of Focus on the Family. I checked into the hotel room, and I got to my room, and the room phone rings. And I thought, this is weird. People usually call me on my cell phone, but I thought they were calling to check how the room was. And the front desk said, the tornado sirens are going off. You need to either get in the bathtub or get in the closet. And I thought for sure that Glenn Stanton was playing a joke on me. And he said, you've got to be joking. And I said, no, the tornado is coming. And so I got in the bathtub. I'm no fool. One of our rules tonight is going to be that I don't speak for John and John doesn't speak for me, but I know I can speak for both of us when I say we are very grateful to the Etz Family Institute and to Knox College for allowing us to be their inaugural event for tonight. Good to see you. So John and I decided that we would start with some personal history related to the culture wars. Do you want to say something?
Hello, it's great to be here. And yeah, I just want to express my gratitude as well. And I think one of the things I'm particularly excited about to be here with John is that this is a local community. I mean, it's a college and a town, but a community, and it's in the local where there's possibility right now. it's very hard to see possibility and imagination at the level of the US Congress, for example. This is where things happen. So I'm delighted to be here with all of you, and thanks to Thomas and Conrad and others for making this possible.
So John and I met once before at Wayne State University, which is my home institution. He came to talk about his book, Learning to Disagree, which is a great book. I highly recommend it. He also has another book, Confident Pluralism, which is another book I recommend. And the format of that event was different. John spoke for a while, and then a panel of us got up to give responses. And so this is the first time we're doing this conversational style with each other. But we had beers earlier at Iron Spike, so we're good.
Beverages.
Beverages. So we decided we were going to start by talking about personal history. My involvement in the culture wars really started when I was in college, when I came out of the closet as a gay man. And I was at St. John's University in New York in the late 80s. And the thing that really solidified my participation in the culture wars was in 1992. I was a graduate student at the University of Texas at Austin, and we were doing what we then called Gay and Lesbian Awareness Week. And we didn't have a big budget for those kinds of events. And so we went around the room to the members of the club and said, what can you do? What can you do? And we had a history graduate student. We said, you can do something about the history of the gay rights movement. And we had a psychology graduate student, and we said, you could do something about the American Psychological Association's position on homosexuality. And they got to me, and they said, John, you're a graduate student in philosophy. You focus on ethics. Why don't you do something on the moral arguments against same-sex relationships? So I did a lecture entitled, What's Morally Wrong with Homosexuality? And that lecture was videotaped. It was actually a VHS tape. And that tape got shared around to various campuses, and I started getting invitations to speak on these campuses, which is how I got my career started speaking and writing about same-sex love and same-sex relationships and same-sex marriage. Marriage didn't really come onto the horizon until the early 2000s. In the mid-90s, there was something in Hawaii, of course. Hawaii briefly debated same-sex marriage. But it wasn't until the early 2000s that I started getting invitations to debate same-sex marriage on college campuses. And I started debating Glenn Stanton of Focus on the Family. I mentioned him earlier. And then I was debating Maggie Gallagher of the National Organization for Marriage, the premier organization fighting same-sex marriage in the country. And then I started with Sharif Girgis and Ryan Anderson and various other people. And throughout the course of those debates, dialogues, I developed some interesting relationships and even friendships. And people would often ask me, how can you be friends with someone who is actively fighting against your rights? And the answer to that question was very simple. I drink. No, the answer to that question was complicated. And I hope over the course of the evening, the answer to that question comes out more clearly. But at least part of the answer was a strong awareness within myself that we had to share the world together. And when I started speaking on these issues in the early 90s, over 70% of the country was against same-sex relationships of any sort. Marriage wasn't even on the table then. And then when I did the book with Maggie Gallagher in 2012, we had lost every state ballot initiative in which marriage equality was on the ballot. So I knew that in order to persuade other people that I was going to have to enter into dialogue. And part of the answer to the question was also a matter of personal temperament. Sometimes you just click with certain people, and I clicked with these people because we were really interested in creating something different, not the usual sound bites that you would see on cable news at the time, but a thoughtful dialogue. And part of it was high-minded ideas about respect for persons, respect for truth, and part of it, frankly, was strategy. I realized that in order to convince other people that it wasn't going to do me any good shouting at people, it was better to engage in a thoughtful dialogue in front of audiences. So that's how I got involved in the culture wars, and I ended up doing, as Thomas mentioned, several point-counterpoint books and a lot of speeches and debates. And I look forward to this dialogue tonight.
Great, thanks, John. And I'm going to emphasize more of the learning to disagree part than the culture wars part, and we'll see where this conversation goes and ends up. But the key to, I think, understanding me and how I fit into this discussion is where my scholarship begins and ends, which is with the First Amendment's right of assembly. Little known, a little better known since I've been writing about it, but still vastly unknown to most Americans. I think 17% of Americans could even name the right of assembly in the First Amendment, which is pretty shocking. But I think about the core civil liberties around assembly, the right to gather, the right to protest, the right to form your own group and a group of your choosing, and to set and dig into your own beliefs and figure them out without a majority or a government telling you what to do. And what's been interesting for me in the last 15 years, writing, speaking, and advocating around assembly, is I have come into contact with all kinds of conversation partners. So I have advocated for and sometimes represented everyone from labor protesters to Black Lives Matter to Occupy Wall Street to conservative Christians to anti-abortion protesters to student protesters. Once in a while, I'm the object of the student protest, which is less comfortable, but I like the theory and the practice around protests and the civil liberties that go around that, and also the importance of the groups behind the protest where the real work often happens. And through that work, I've learned about this idea of disagreement and difference. And then at the same time, for me as a Christian, I have increasingly watched Christians in this country, at least a subset of those Christians, become increasingly anxious and angry and fearful and combative. And the civil liberties world, as it has unfolded, there are people out there who are arguing for civil liberties on behalf of everyone, but there are also others, including some conservative Christians, who will say civil liberties are really only for us. Religious freedom is really only for us. And that it doesn't work like that. And the only way that civil liberties, free speech, assembly, these other rights work are if you say these are important to me, and these are also important to protecting the person who I don't like. And it means facilitating the beliefs and practices of people who I might not otherwise agree with. And that's the ballgame. So a lot of my recent work has been trying to speak to two different audiences. A broad audience that says, this is how we need to understand civil liberties. Sure. Great. A broad audience that understands civil liberties across the board, and then also to a specifically Christian audience that is, frankly, often outgunned with money and networks on the far right, and wanting to say there is a different way of engagement, a way that starts with the posture of what does it mean to live both faithfully and authentically in a world that we don't necessarily control? And that lack of control is an important thing. And here, we'll bring up lots of hopefully fun issues tonight, but I do think that there's a racial component to some of this as well, that for much of our country's history, there was a white Protestant majority that assumed a cultural baseline in this country. And that speaks for a large section of this country today, but not all of the country, and obviously not also all of the Christians in this country. So for me as a Japanese American who's been in and out of predominantly white culture, but also comes from a family who was interned during World War II and whose father was born in the camps, I'm always a little skeptical of the people claiming either majority power or rights just for me. So as a civil libertarian at the core, I want to ensure that we have rights for everybody, and then let's have the hard discussions we need to have in order to make a democracy work.
So in that vein, do you want to say a little bit about your recent book?
Yeah, that sounds good. This new book, Learning to Disagree, is a kind of experiment for me. It's much more of a story-based book, lessons from the classroom. I'm a law professor. I teach classes like criminal law and law and religion, and those classes are just full of minefields. So we spend the entire semester walking through really hard issues where there's strong feeling and disagreement, and then having to navigate within the class across some of those differences, but all for the sake of trying to train lawyers how to do this on their behalf, but also for the sake of the broader country and the system of democracy. And so I thought, this book started in the middle of the pandemic, and I thought if I can get a storytelling format out there that brings the reader into the classroom, and then also explains some of my own screw-ups along the way, how I teach in the morning and then in the afternoon screw this up with my family and my friends and my neighbors, and maybe there's a way to illustrate how the learning part of Learning to Disagree is an ongoing activity that we never quite finish, but we all should be committed to. So that's the nature of the book, and the real pitch here is to convince you who might think lawyers are the problem to realize that lawyers might be part of the solution to navigating our current and future differences.
Yeah. One of the things I really appreciated about the book was the sense of humility I got from you. You know, I'm married to a lawyer, and I think lawyers often have a reputation of being know-it-alls. You probably have some on your faculty. But I really appreciated the stories where you talked about like screwing up yourself, because I think those are really the moments where we learn, the learning part of learning to disagree, as you said.
Well, I think this is something to, as we set the tone for the project, not just of tonight, but for this institute going forward, for this community going forward, the way that you engage authentically across disagreement is with a kind of curiosity and necessarily a kind of humility. If you come into conversations thinking, I know everything, I'm perfect, I have all the right answers, it's not going to go well, and you're almost categorically wrong in those claims anyway. So what would it look like to come into a discussion with someone, even someone who you think is completely wrong-headed or supports a policy or a candidate who you think is bad for this country, and instead of just writing that person off, or instead of coming in with a desire to preach, maybe start with the curious questions. Tell me how you came to this belief. What about your experience leads you to this particular perspective? And take the time to learn before you sort of spout your own views.
One of the interesting distinctions you make in the book is the distinction between seeing someone as wrong versus seeing someone as evil. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and then I want to ask you some about this in your own experience too, in your own partnerships across these lines. So I try to make the point that once you move from seeing your opponent as wrong to evil, it's very hard to walk back that line. And too many of us are seeing this happen across politics and the rest of society right now. If you think someone is wrong, you can still have lunch with that person. You can still try to persuade them, and you can think they're deeply wrong about an issue that matters. They're going to vote for that candidate who you think is going to wreck the country, or that policy that you think is extremely high stakes and is going to cause human suffering. But if you think they're wrong, you're still going to be in it with them. And you're going to go to school with them, and you're going to go downtown to eat with them. If you think they're evil, none of that really happens. Your goal with evil is to minimize evil, to get it out of your life and get it out of the world. And when we start to see, and this especially happens, we're lured to this on social media when we don't see human beings, but we see the caricatures and the sound bites, and we think that person is evil. Once we go there, it's very hard to bring it back. Now, what I'm curious about in this vein is your own experience on issues that matter deeply to you, where really everything is at stake, not just in a theoretical matter, but for you personally, for your marriage, for your family, for your relationships, and still being able to engage with people who have a very different view, where if they are successful, there will be direct and dire consequences for you. So how do you think about this line between wrong versus evil and the partnerships?
You know, I wish I could say that I have some like high-minded principle, and I do have principles. It's good to have principles. But I really think part of it for me was a matter of personal temperament. I really like getting along with people, and I try to find something about everyone that I can get along with and that clicks with me. And, it's interesting. If you look at my CV, you'll see a few one-off debates I did on same-sex marriage. And I did a bunch of debates with Glenn Stanton, with whom I developed a good rapport. And, I knew that Glenn in those debates was not going to take cheap shots. And I knew that Maggie Gallagher was not going to take cheap shots. And we would go from debate to debate, and we'd sometimes spend hours in the car with each other. And we genuinely developed a friendship over the course of that. And it's funny because a bit of the background for tonight, I asked you several times, are we okay with jeans and sport coats? And the reason I kept asking you was that I once did an event at a church in California, and the pastor of that church told me that he was going to be wearing jeans, and he shows up in a suit, deliberately to embarrass me, like, I would show up underdressed. And fortunately, I had khakis and a sport coat on, and I looked okay. But, there were various people over the course of my experience that I really did not respect. Not that I would place them in the evil category. I genuinely understand what they were trying to do. They thought same-sex marriage was bad for children, bad for families, bad for America, and they wanted to prevent that. I thought it was good for children, good for families, good for America, and I wanted to achieve it. But, it's funny. We talk about bigotry and being stubbornly or obstinately devoted to your principles. How many of you have principles that you are stubbornly devoted to? All of us do. If I agree with those, I'm going to call them convictions. If I disagree with them, I'm going to call them bigotry. So I think that's an interesting move that we make in the course of these discussions.
I'm interested that you started these conversations and debates in the mid to late 90s, and the issues then were high stakes, and the popular opinion was quite different at the time, and yet it felt like the broader framework of the mid to late 90s was still different than it feels today around a range of issues, where it felt like you could still watch a presidential debate, and even though some pundits would say this is the most important election in history. Most people didn't actually believe that.
Right.
And there's something that has shifted in the last 25 years. So what is that something? Where are we today, and how does it compare to the late 90s or other parts of history in this country? And how should we be thinking about the current moment relative to where we've been?
I think one of the things that changed certainly is social media. It's easier to get into our own bubbles and not have to interact with people we disagree with. I think one of the things that's changed is the availability of cable news. And you can pick the news channel you want on the basis of your political dispositions. When we grew up, we're about the same age. When we grew up, there were like 5 channels to choose from. And you got your news from one of those channels or from the newspaper. What do you think?
I would agree with those changes. I mean, I do think anytime we start to talk about the fraughtness of the current moment, I find it helpful to replay a little bit of history to realize we have come from some very hard times. And so the first thing people will say is, well, we did have a civil war, yes, and a lot of people died. We also had massive class and labor unrest in the 1920s. We had massive unrest in the 1960s with a bomb a day going off in this country. We've had other earlier moments in history. We could start with a long list from Jim Crow to the Japanese internment to the denial of women to vote, all kinds of examples throughout history where it has been a lot worse. And there are a lot of people in this country today who would say, I would happily take 2024 over, give me a time period 30, 40, 60 years ago for various reasons. And so there is a sense in which it's important to say things have not all gotten worse. Things in this country are meaning to be better for a whole lot of people, and that matters. And we have, at the same time, despite our imperfections, despite how much work still needs to be done, we can point to partial progress along the way. Even going back to the founding of this country, when you look at how the country started with the negotiations around things like religious freedom, and people will often say, well, how hard was it for white Protestant male landowners to get along? And in some ways, that's not much difference to when we look at it today, except at that time, elsewhere in the world, they were killing each other over those differences. So that's actually a major accomplishment, and we can look back. And I think part of understanding the present is being honest about the past. And honesty about the past is both remembering its flaws and imperfections, but also celebrating some of its successes. So in that vein, I think today feels maybe not so much different than past episodes, but you're right, I think, to point to the way in which we're consuming news, and especially social media, and I think it's going to get a lot worse. So we have the coming weeks are going to get amped up with the algorithms and the existing echo chambers, and with advances in AI and other technology, the incentives are not there for everyone to start being otherly minded and democratic and committed to the common good. The incentives are, how do I make money? How do I maximize fear and use extremes to get people to understand or agree with my side?
Are you on social media?
I am on social, very reluctantly. I'm terrible at social media. So with this last book, my agent, she didn't force me, but she nudged me to get on Facebook, which I'd never been on. And it turns out I'd missed a lot of life. Like all of my high school classmates from 30 years ago were on Facebook, and so I discovered all these people who I'd lost touch with. And then when I asked to friend them, they thought, surely this is like a bot or something, because what Gen Xer joins Facebook in 2023? But it was me. So I'm like kind of barely on Facebook. I actually thought Twitter was interesting for a while, but I have an account, but I'm almost never there. And then I try to follow the news through Threads. My daughter set up an Instagram account, which I don't really know how to use. That's about it. So that's me. How about you?
I never got into Twitter or X, whatever they call it now. I have an account like when I did my books, I would post things related to the book. I've been on Facebook for a long time, and recently I got on Instagram. I had to post a picture of this beautiful theater on Instagram earlier.
This, though, on the social media point, I mean, and it's sort of peeling back the onion of how things are working in the world right now. But if you are, for people, we both write books and publish books, and we want people to read our books. Most publishers today, their first question to you is, what is your social media following? Mm-hmm. Not, do you have a good idea, right? Not are you a great writer, but what is your social media following? And if not your following, who do you know who has a large social media following? And this is kind of a disaster, but it reflects the incentives, not just of book publishing, but everything else, right? Look at who the influences are, or who you or I might notice responding to urgent national events. It used to be, for the day when we would have titles like Professor of Philosophy or Professor of Law, and just because of the title and the institutional affiliation, people might ask us, well, what do you think about this issue of philosophy? And today, you're just as likely to find famous person with large social media following weighing in on a breaking news issue or something else, often without an expertise or nuance, and at the same time, people are increasingly just skeptical of people like us and institutions that support us, and sometimes with good reason. So we're in a state where expertise and nuance and lack of flashiness is very hard sometimes to gain traction.
I think the problem with social media is not only that it stamps out nuance, but it demands our immediate response and immediate attention. There were debates that would play themselves out over weeks and months, where you could, like, try out an idea. You could say to a couple of friends, hey, I was thinking, like, maybe, and you could have that kind of back and forth before you would be ready for prime time for that discussion. And now I think we are expected to post our opinions very quickly when we haven't had that time to try out ideas.
Yeah, that's right, and also that you could, I'm thinking of the students here, you all grew up in a nothing but the social media era, and it used to be, especially as a kid, when you're younger, you could say stupid things.
Right.
And sometimes stupid things got you in trouble with your friends, or maybe they got you suspended. Now those stupid things go online, and they define you in perpetuity. And the pressure of, like a 12-year-old kid to get it exactly right is unbearable in some ways. And we're doing that to each other, we're doing that to our kids, and it feels very, very costly. We have to, we've extracted the possibility of making mistakes and learning and trying things out, which is how you gain knowledge in the world.
What do you think is the role of academia in all of this?
Yeah, how much time do we have for this one? I think I would sort of go back to where I started tonight, which is focus on the local. What is the mission and purpose of this institution, of Knox, and how are you living into those goals and possibilities? We both teach at complex universities. At Washington University, we have not just an educational mission, but we own a lot of real estate, and we have a hospital that does a lot of outpatient care and clinical care, and we have lots of investments in the global program, and it's very hard in the midst of all that to figure out what even is an academic institution, what are our priorities, and what are our values. And if you can't answer those basic questions, it becomes very hard to figure out what you're about. At a smaller, more focused institution, you actually have the possibility of saying, this is what an academic institution is. This is what it means to teach, to trust each other, to make mistakes, to learn together. And so I'm excited about these possibilities in some institutions, and then I'm much more skeptical about them in others that I won't name here.
Right.
But so yeah, I'm curious about your experience at another complex institution.
I like to believe that we carve out a special place You know, our academic institutions should be a place where we can step back from all of this and have thoughtful dialogue about these issues. It doesn't always work out that way, as you know. But I strongly believe that we need to lean into that.
So you're not just a faculty member, but you're an administrator and you oversee a college within the university. What's the role of non-academic discourse in your world, or what's the role of protest in a university setting, do you think?
I mean, the role of protest in a university setting, I think, is much like the role of protest any other place. We want to draw attention to what we think are injustices, and protest is sometimes the most effective way to do that. You know, when I hear critiques of civil discourse, you know, and civility, that's what I'm thinking of. You know, it's funny because we heard a radio show, or at least I heard the radio show this morning, one of your local radio shows, where the host was reading off Facebook comments about this event, and apparently one of the people who wrote in said that they thought this event was going to be a load of crap in which liberal indoctrination would happen. And I think, you know, what I was expecting that they would object to was the notion of civic discourse. You know, we had a Year of Focus event that you were invited to at Wayne State, and we had all kinds of debates about the notion of civic discourse and civility, because people think civility is phony, people think it's distracting, and people think it reinforces injustice because it preserves the status quo, and sometimes you really have to like break things to get people's attention. And I think part of our current moment is that a lot of people feel like they can't get enough attention, and they're turning to protest and breaking things, sometimes literally, in order to do that.
Yeah, that seems right to me. And then there, if not, I mean, one move is to go to the protest break things mode. The other is, if you've got the right people in your pocket, whether it's the legislature or someone else, try to use force or power in a different direction to impose your own views or to try to extract other views. And so one of the things I've noticed that's super interesting right now in our current moment is you've got part of campus life and society at large that looks at something like civil discourse very skeptically and says, you're the people who are trying to tell us, you know, to placate, or you're the people in power just really asking us to be passive. And then you've got other people who, whenever they hear anything like the importance of equity or inclusion, they immediately think that's coded for a liberal takeover and they want nothing to do with that. And really, I think for most people who are trying to be part of a complex institution with people who have very different opinions and experiences, you have to actually do a dance with both of those, and both of those ideas are important. And sometimes it's important to slow down and do discourse, and sometimes it's important to recognize moments of strategic incivility, and sometimes it's important to teach partnerships and coalitions, and other times you might decide you have to burn bridges. But I would say, if you are in the bridge burning mode, just make sure you're counting the costs, because sometimes the very people with whom you're burning bridges are those who you will need on your side to advance whatever cause you want. And this is actually, you know, thinking about the broader political climate right now, and we are a few weeks away from a big event. There's a notion today of politics that is being reinforced, especially at the national level by both parties, that is a politics without compromise. It's a winner-take-all, zero-sum mode of engagement, and a lot of politics is zero-sum in the sense that people win and lose, but usually to function well, it requires a compromise that nobody likes fully. Nobody fully gets their way, especially in a diverse democracy. And that's how things have gotten done in this country for a long, long time, with a few examples where, as an alternative to compromise, people said things like, no, actually, we need to go to war, right? And that should be, hopefully to most people, a very, very, very last resort.
Yes.
And even in the midst of otherwise extremely intractable and hard issues, the possibility of compromise and policy and law and academic discourse is far preferable to let's take up arms and start killing each other. And it seems to me like we've got lots of examples elsewhere in the world where that's happening right now. So we might start by asking, what does it mean to strengthen the possibilities that we have, however imperfect and flawed that they are, rather than immediately start to want to burn them down?
Thomas talked in his introduction about habits of character, and I think it's easy to develop a habit of ratcheting up disagreement. It's much harder to develop a habit of slowing down, of listening and learning. And I think we see the results of this kind of ratcheting up.
It's super interesting. This doesn't work for every issue, but when you look at national polling about many, many issues, the majority of Americans are somewhere in that compromise zone. That you would never know this by just looking at your socials or your news sources often, but people realize these issues are complex for a reason. And you hear these extreme positions that don't avail of any nuance, and then you realize, actually, if you sit down and talk to someone, like if we actually had the time, and it would never work in a group of this size, but find a few friends or a few classmates and dig into a hard issue, pick an issue and dig into it, and look at some source material, and then try to understand why is it that somebody who would vote differently on this issue comes to that perspective. And it's usually not because they're stupid or they're just evil. It's usually because for a complex set of judgments and experiences and reliance on certain facts and values that they come to a view of things that is different than yours. And there still might in the midst of that be a right and a wrong way, and then the goal is to persuade why you're right and they're wrong. But you can't do that if you caricature as overly simplistic. And I think part of what we try to do in the academic world is to say, let's take advantage of this opportunity to have the extended conversation.
It's interesting, the polarization works in a couple different ways. It works at creating distance between those we see as other, and then it works in a way of radicalizing our own views with respect to our end group. We tend to be pulled to the extremes. I don't know if you are familiar with Bob Talisa's work at Vanderbilt. Yeah, he's done a bunch of studies. He's a philosophy professor, but he gets into some social science. He's done a bunch of studies about how polarization works, and it's not just like that we otherize people, but that we tend to become more extreme versions of ourselves.
Yeah, this is where I think social media dooms us, because like all the smart people who are making a lot of money have figured out that the dopamine really works with us. And so we get on Twitter and 20 people like our tweet and we just think America now agrees with us, right? Or you're on Instagram and 100 of your friends click the little heart and then suddenly you're the most popular person in the world. And this is how we go through life thinking this, and we actually fall into these narratives. And if we were just to pause for a minute and think, is that real? Or are we just reinforcing our own priors? And how could that possibly be in a country of over 300 million people who come from all different parts of the world with different experiences? How is it possible that we suddenly decide that people either really like us or really agree with our viewpoints. It's just not how life works, and we can sort of stumble into that false kind of reality. So, as someone, you said you, other than Facebook, maybe are not much on social media, how do you experience life largely away from it? And are there ideas or practices in your own life that you find helpful to resisting the false reality that can often emerge online?
I enjoy real conversation with people. Look, I am on social media, so I don't want to give the impression that I, don't get up in the morning and it's the first thing I check. It tends to be the first thing I check. But, I try to take breaks from it, realizing, as you said, that the dopamine works, that, the people who design social media do not have our interests in mind, they have advertisers' interest in mind. They really count on us wanting to go back and, see those likes and get that reinforcement.
I just want to underscore and agree with you on the point about taking breaks from social media, and if you can, especially students, again, if you can figure out a way to do this now, it will serve you well later in life. So one of the things, and I'm not like you, I make lots of screw-ups and mistakes, like in terms of responding to the excitement of whatever is on my phone. But I would say I try hard once a week to take about 24 hours just completely offline. And then once a year, my family and I disappear for a week and are off the grid. And in that week, it's really remarkable what happens in my head and in my world, where I just kind of forget about what else is out there and I focus on the people in front of me. And sometimes this usually happens over the summer, and it's June, and often the Supreme Court waits to release its blockbuster cases in June, and sometimes I check in a week later and I've missed a bunch of media calls and I think, oh, I could have been quoted in the New York Times, except then I realize nobody cared that I wasn't, right? Life went on and it wasn't a big deal, and I got to throw the football with my kid on the beach, and that was probably a lot better use of my time and my headspace. So these breaks are useful, one, to just unplug and get off of it, but also just to remind you of like what life at its core really is.
Speaking of looking at the people in front of us, should we start taking audience questions?
Yeah, sounds great. So we're interested in your questions, and we've got very well-credentialed mic runners too.
All right, so I've got a microphone here, and so if you raise your hand, I can pass you the microphone. And we've only got one right now, so I'll start on this side of the room, and then I'll make my way that way.
Can you be more specific about what people are disagreeing about?
What's that?
What are people disagreeing about?
What are people disagreeing about? Well, I'll start and you can pick up, but is this, depending on the presidential election, there are people who think that the country is doomed one way or the other, so that's a big disagreement. The war in Ukraine, the Middle East, transgender rights, immigration, gun control, abortion.
Pineapple on pizza?
Actually, let me pick up on that point though. Not all disagreement is bad, right? A lot of disagreement in the world actually makes the world more interesting. If you have different musical tastes or sports allegiances, that's great. But a lot of disagreement in the world is really hard and leads to lots of tragedy and heartbreak. And when people, especially in the same political space, which is us in this room and us in this country, disagree about these high stakes issues, then lots of tension. What is the proper relationship between police and minority communities? What's the relevant use of force by the U.S. military overseas? I would think a long list of things that really matter to people, and that people, in my experience with my students, I have a steady stream of students who say, I am no longer talking to my parents or my grandparents or people back home, and that seems to be increasing, I think.
Do you think that it's a privilege to be able to have this kind of like rapport with people that disagree with you? You know, you're talking about John Corvino, like having debates with people who are opposing gay marriage and just like homosexual rights and things like that. Do you feel that that's a privilege to be able to have those conversations? And like, how does that affect how you're having those conversations and how you're viewing the discussion?
Thank you for that question. Certainly, I think it's a privilege. You know, I am a tenured philosophy professor. You know, I'm not going to lose my job, you know, because of these debates. I am not going to, you know, my husband and I are very comfortable, and we were comfortable even before we were able to be legally married. And I frequently recognized my privilege in being able to do that as a financially comfortable person with a good job and, you know, an academic setting. And what I would say to people who would ask me about doing that as a gay man, I would say, you know, I'm able to do it. That doesn't mean that you need to do it. I want people to protect themselves in these dialogues, in this kind of discourse.
Yeah, and maybe I would just add too that I think with the recognition of privilege is the recognition of some responsibility. I mean, this entire conversation is a massive privilege. Right? To be here in relative safety and to have an extended evening talking about these kinds of issues. If you are, like, if most of your day is you're not sure what you're going to eat or if you're going to be physically safe from violence around you, it's very hard to talk about disagreement and difference. So I think given that we're all here, given that many of you are spending part of your lives in school and taking classes, I mean, what does it mean to take seriously that, not just the opportunity, but maybe the responsibility of that? I think about this, you know, like you, these jobs are wonderfully privileged jobs, and the students that we get to interact with, and to see it not just as, you know, oh, one more class to teach, or one more paper to write, or one more lecture to attend, but what is the opportunity here, and what is the responsibility that comes with the opportunity?
Yes.
How do you think the dynamics of civil discourse change if we're talking about the geopolitical sphere of, let's say, a third world country rather than a first world country?
Developing nations versus first world countries?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, when people are hungry, that's going to be first and foremost on their minds. When people are like being bombed, as is happening in the Middle East right now, that's going to be first and foremost on their mind. Like, civil discourse is not going to be a priority for them, you know.
Yeah, and I think like part of what is implicit that we might want to name as well is there are limits to reasonable boundaries of disagreement, right? This would be a much different conversation if someone in this room were sitting here with a swastika on their arm band, right? Because we would say, that person is not welcome here. Like, we welcome lots of diverse viewpoints, but not that person. And if in a counterfactual we had the actual neo-Nazi in this room, then we would be having a much different conversation. So, and when you're in a war zone, a literal war zone, you're not going to have a conversation about how do we disagree about a policy nuance. Your first issue is going to be how do we stop like killing each other in the moment. And so context is everything, I think, and I think that's a super important question. And then to recognize that this doesn't just happen by accident, but that a lot of careful thought, work, and sacrifice from people who've gone before us make it possible for us to be in this room under these circumstances now.
You can both weigh in on this, but this is more directed at Mr. Inazu, as I know your focus is on public assembly. But how much power and influence on federal government decisions do you actually think rallies and protests, especially student-led ones, actually has?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so one of the things, first of all, from the student perspective, I think we can look back at history, and almost every student generation has a protest element to it. And I think we can look back and see how student protests have done actually quite a bit of influence on American politics over time. And so in part of where that comes from, I think, is for many students, you show up at a college or university and you're exposed to an enormous set of issues and possibilities without necessarily having the tools or the plan to try to address them. But you sit and you experience, or you are aware of injustices in new ways, and it would make total sense that you want to engage with them. So then the question becomes, what does strategic engagement look like? And sometimes for some students it's, let's protest now at this institution because we have a plan and because our plan is actionable within this institution. For others it might be, let me go back to school for 10 years and study something very carefully. Or let me get together with a couple of graduate students in specific areas of knowledge and let's form a plan for a coalition. Or for others it's, let me get some real world training and go intern on Capitol Hill for a while and plan a career. So I think there's a matter of personal discernment here. Personal discernment is often elevated with collective action, but collective action should be strategic. And so in answer to your question of how much can it actually matter, well, it depends on whether you've properly read the context and the possibilities. And sometimes a student protest can go all the way to the attention of the White House, and other times it peters out with absolutely no consequence or effect at all, except maybe some people get suspended. So I think it's counting the costs, and it's being very strategic about what the plan is. And I think this is one thing because I spend a lot of time talking with student protesters, and one of the things I want to say is, tell me, you can't care about everything. I mean, you can experience the pain of a lot of things, especially as you're showing up to college, but you can't solve the world's problems. So pick one or two issues that you really care about, get very smart at them, and then have a plan on how to address them. And then I actually think people can change the world with that kind of approach.
So in areas where like traditional views are often more dominant, what do you think is the approach to open dialogue between different generations while still respecting cultural views and values?
I feel like I did this for a long time because I started my same-sex marriage advocacy work in the late 80s and early 90s when the vast majority of the country had traditional views on these things. And I think one of the things that's important is understanding what people really care about. Like when I came out to my parents, they were not initially cool with it, but that was largely because they wanted me to have a good life, and they couldn't wrap their minds around how I could do that as a gay man. If we try to give people the benefit of the doubt, which is a problematic notion, I can problematize the notion. I've actually been working on a book related to these themes. If we try to give people the benefit of the doubt, we can really learn a lot. And I say that it's a problematic notion because in sometimes giving one individual the benefit of the doubt, we ignore third parties' needs. If we give the abuser the benefit of the doubt, like when he tells his story, we might ignore the battered person. But I think if we apply that principle consistently and fairly of giving each person's story the benefit of the doubt, we can really learn a lot, and particularly in traditional spaces.
I think there's also something interesting. Your question made me think of this, but I actually think intergenerational friendship and learning is such a great upside potential for this country and our sub-communities, but we're not very good at it. And I think one of the confounding factors is the people who are now older when they think of mentoring and what mentoring was for them from the generations two above them, it was, you sit there and learn from me because I have wisdom to tell you and I'm in a position of power. And now for a lot of younger people, when they think of mentoring, it has to be much more relational and much more asymmetrical. It's what can we learn from each other and how can we grow together? And so for the people who are now maybe most naturally positioned to be mentors, you almost have to rethink what mentoring and friendship, intergenerational friendship is. It's not what you grew up on because the world has changed in some significant ways, but there's still possibilities if you can reframe what that relationship looks like and not see, if you happen to be older, not see a younger person as a project or someone who's going to learn a lot from you, but as a potential relationship and conversation partner.
One of the things I often say in the culture wars is it's important to build relationships first, because then you develop the space of trust where you can really engage in that dialogue without thinking that the other person is going to come back with a gotcha.
The discussion earlier on the distinction between thinking someone is wrong and thinking that they're evil, that you got into with an appreciable level of nuance, made me think about the level of social pressure that is often present in the culture wars, and how I've noticed a chilling effect in conversations with people where I don't feel like I can say, I disagree with something you just said, because I don't think even a friend would give me the benefit of the doubt over, I don't think you're human, for example. Like, I basically wanted to ask what you thought of that kind of deliberate wielding of social pressure to cool debate and how you navigate that.
I mean, it's huge, what you just named. I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think especially, if you are in a certain age demographic, let's call it Gen Z, right, or around there, this is a huge issue. And it's not so much that people or institutions are saying you can't talk about this, but it's this sense of, especially in peer groups, that if you say the wrong thing, you're done. And part of that is, I think, a responsiveness from broader cultural signals that have a purification of ideology, where it's no longer like, well, you can hold complex and idiosyncratic views about lots of things and still be aligned, but it's, if you're not with us, then you must be the enemy and evil. And we're seeing that in politics, and we're seeing that play out, but it's having an effect on the student generation for sure. And so how then do you work against that? I don't think there's any substitute for trust building that necessarily takes time. And again, I think only happens in smaller settings. So I'll give you one example from my teaching experience, and then I'll be interested in John's thoughts on this too. But I was teaching an undergraduate class 2 years ago, political philosophy, so it was just mostly reading texts and then talking about it. And at the end of the semester, this was about 10 or 12 students, so you can't do this in a big lecture class, but with 12 students, I said, okay, for our last two classes, we're going to change it up, and instead of the readings, each of you needs to come to class and share 5 minutes on an issue that you care passionately about, that you would be terrified to talk about publicly at Washington University. And then, in front of your classmates, I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes grilling you with every possible counter-objection I can think of. And you can imagine the collective thud when I said, this is what we're doing. But they showed up, they all did it, they had wildly extreme views across the ideological spectrum on all kinds of issues, and they were very, they started off very, very gingerly and worried, but then they realized they could make their positions, engage in discussion and challenge, and still nobody walked out of the classroom. And at the end of that experiment, a lot of students were very grateful that it had happened, and then one of them said, Professor, this was so good, you need to do this again next year, except to make the whole class just this. I said, do you realize if on day one I said, this is what we're doing, every one of you would have dropped, right? Because, and this is the key point, it was only because of the trust building we'd done for 11 weeks of dialoguing with each other and getting to know each other that it was possible to take those risks. That's replicable, but you can't hurry it and you can't scale it to large sizes. So I would say, figure out those trusted friends and then take some risks in a setting that allows that possibility.
And that's one of the distinctive things about academic seminars. You can build that trust over the course of a semester. One of the things you said was, what if somebody believes you're not human? And I want to make it clear that I agree with John that there are people who really are not productive to have in the conversation. Certainly, someone who does not recognize the humanity of participants in the conversation would be that kind of person.
Agreed, and I think this is also part of your question, that kind of language or conversation stopper is often deployed when there's probably a more nuanced conversation to have. And so, if you encounter you're denying my humanity, or you're threatening my existence. I mean, I often want to say, especially when I'm teaching future lawyers, like, can we unpack that a bit? Like, tell me how in the moment, right? Another one here is, you're making me feel unsafe, right? The safety line is really, it is deployed often. It sounds like a shield, but it's really a sword. It's an effort to say, I'm shutting you down by claiming a lack of safety, when in fact, often this happens when we're in an academic setting. It might be extremely unsettling. It might be psychologically hurtful. You might actually at some point need to leave a conversation, but the claims of safety, these kinds of conversation stoppers, I think do a lot of work to try to police consensus and stop conversations short of the nuance that we need to have.
Obviously, social media has had a lot of negative consequences, but I was wondering if y'all think that it has had any positive impacts on productive civil discourse.
Oh, tons. Yeah. So, I mean, we have kind of sort of trashed social media for a while, but lots of upsides, right?
Yes.
So, in the protest area, think about the protests that have been possible with online communication that would not have been possible, that have had massive political changes around the globe. So that's a huge upside to discourse. Think about the people who 30 years ago would have thought, I'm the only one who is like this or who feels this way, who've been able to find solidarity and friendship with others in online communities, and the facilitation of dialogue and relationships that would not have been possible in earlier days. So I think there are huge upsides. It's just that we tend to be influenced by some of the downsides.
I agree. Certainly as a gay man, coming out in the late 80s and early 90s, I was in suburban New York at the time. I could have been in Galesburg, that would have enabled me to find a community of like-minded people in a way that was not possible before social media.
I think that for the most part, you can agree that no 5-minute or 10-minute or even hour-long conversation is going to kind of change someone's mind completely on an issue. And so I was wondering what do you think is the ideal environment to create that or have that civil discourse that can lead to a changed opinion or to a compromised position on an issue?
I would start with building relationships. Sometimes student groups come to me and say, we want to model this kind of disagreeing across, profound divides. Should we have a panel? Should we have a debate? And I often say to them, you should have pizza. If you don't like pizza, you're a moral monster. It's not always about hashing out the differences. So one of the things that the college Republicans and the college Democrats did at my university a few years ago was to have a joint toy drive around the holidays. Who's not in favor of kids having toys for the holidays? And I think that kind of relationship building can be a catalyst for deeper understanding and potentially compromise down the road.
Yeah, I would just add, from my perspective, I mean, notice the title of my book is Learning to Disagree, Not Achieving Consensus. And so it might actually be that lots of our conversations are not ultimately going to be to persuade someone to change their mind. And if it is, I would say have very modest goals. So if your mission in life is you need to convince someone to come over to your position, then that might be a lifelong project, right? That might be not just a conversation or a series of conversations, but a 20-year relationship that demonstrates a different possibility. And I think many of us are in a mode of thinking, if we can just get the logical argument out, if we can just get the facts out. But a lot of people today are not persuaded by factual arguments and data. What they're persuaded by are relationships and examples and experiences, and those take time. And they might not ultimately persuade, but I think if you're playing the long game, it's going to be less about making an argument and more about demonstrating a relationship.
All right, so we've got time for one more question, so we'll let Chris Angel here do it.
How you doing? What are some underlying socio-political factors contributing to the 2024 election? Because every time I hear about the 2024 election, it sounds like it's going to be the last election we're ever going to have, depending on which candidate we choose.
We have time for one more question, but we don't have time for the answer. I feel you. Every election in recent memory, people have said this is the most important election of our lifetimes. But this one does feel different in a number of ways. But whatever happens, we'll get through it.
And I think what
Talk about a non-answer.
I think I would just underscore how, if you look at media coverage and quotes from 2020, 2016, even 2012, the language about this person is evil, the country's future is at stake. The election of 1800 had very similar language in some ways. So this has been around for a while. It doesn't mean the stakes aren't high, they are. But it also, I think, and this is, in some circles I hear, if X happens on election day, then democracy ends the next day. Well, two things about that claim are wrong. One, we're not going to know the answer on election day, right? This is going to be a contested election. It's going to take a while to sort out. So dig in and be ready for that. And don't go online to find answers, but look for people near you. But also, one of the reasons, democracy doesn't end in a day. One of the reasons I know this is that I spent 4 years working at the Pentagon, and I can tell you the bureaucracy of the federal government moves far more slowly than that, right? There are a lot of systems, and that's meant to be a little humorous, but also there's some truth behind it, right? We've got lots of built-in systems, and if you're worried about the presidency in particular, then pay attention to the other structures of government that we have that are in many ways designed to mitigate the effects of the presidency. It doesn't mean that we've got a perfect system. It doesn't mean that regardless of what party you care about, the presidency has grown in power in unhealthy ways. It has, but it does mean that a lot of those other checks are still in place, and democracy will go on. You should still engage, you should still vote, you should still care, you should still be concerned, but also to recognize, play the long game here and know that our democracy is a complex system that has a lot of people working hard to preserve it.
And I think it's our responsibility to be those people working hard to preserve it.
On that note, would you give everyone All right, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out for this inaugural event. We hope you have a great night. Would you join me in one final round of applause for our speakers, John Inazu and Dr. Corvino?